Hello and welcome to episode 266 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I'm your host, Mark, the Green Tank. And with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Nealon the Orange Tank.
Hello.
And Kellen the Red Tank.
Hello, hello.
We are still in our discrete locations.
Yep.
Call back to last week's episode. But that won't be for long, as the guys are going to be coming to my place shortly as we get ready for Dice Tower West. You guys excited? I am excited.
I'm very excited. It kind of keeps sneaking up in me in my head when I know it's 2 weeks away, and then the next time I think about it, I forget it's the next week, and now it's like literally a week from now, practically.
Right.
It's wild.
We all get to use the same toilet.
That's right. Anyhow, on this week's episode, we are going to be returning to our designer deep dives. Did we call this BGB Designer of Games, BGB DOG?
No,
You guys are stupid.
Wait, oh yes, designers of games.
Yeah.
You know
yeah.
nothing about branding.
No, you have a dog. You have like a cute dog. Dogs are cute. Everybody wants to buy stuff that has dogs on it. This is BGB DOG. You have a little puppy. And then depending on the designer, the puppy's face takes on their face.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
A different breed for each designer.
Yeah. So imagine, if you will, listeners and Kellen, like a beagle. Or like a basset hound, like big floppy ears, real cute, big long tongue. But instead of the beagle face or the basset hound face, imagine the face of Bruna Cathala. For those who don't know, a French man, but that face instead of a regular dog face. So Bruna Cathala head, basset hound body. You get it? Kellen.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just think that when you tweet out, like, we're so excited, it's the designer focus on Mr. Bruno Cathala, he's going to listen to this.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing you want him to hear?
Probably not. I hadn't considered that part of it. Mr. Cathala, I'm very excited to do this. But, this is our thing. We have designer dogs, dog designers, DOG, BGB DOG. Welcome to the club. Here you go. So, we're going to be doing that deep dive on Mr. Cathala's illustrious career. But before that, we're going to be talking about the games that we've played. Neil is going to be talking about Skytear Horde, which is, a sequel to Skytear? Or
yeah, it's like a solo cooperative version of Skytear.
Oh, cool. And I'll be talking about endless...
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Did you hear the words he used?
Mark's excited.
Solo. You say solo cooperative? I actually forgotten what he said. Anyhow... And I'll be talking about Endless Winter Paleoamericans.
Ooh.
Yeah, look at that. Hot. Speaking of hot, before we get into both of those games, I'm going to talk about another game that is super hot. And you know why it's super hot? Because it wasn't on Board Game Geek until I added it. So this is the first game that I've ever proposed, submitted to the website to be added as an official game. And if you, the listener, go to Board Game Geek, and you look up Smart 4 Connected, that is a game that I recommended and had added to the list of games on Board Game Geek. So a quick thing about Smart 4 Connected. I have no idea where you would acquire this. I think it's on Amazon, but my girlfriend picked it up through whatever means she has of finding weird games. So this is a Connect 4 type of game, but it's a Connect 4 game on an electronic board. And you can Connect 4 in the standard way, like on a two-dimensional plane, but you also can connect 4 three-dimensionally. So you can have 4 in a row straight up, or you can have 4 in a row on a diagonal, but on 4 different levels. So that in and of itself is fine. Connect 4 is fine, and three-dimensional Connect 4 is sort of interesting. And to be totally frank, I wasn't expecting much of this game. But the thing is, like, this sort of added fun twist is that whenever you place a piece and your opponent places a piece, you place a piece on this board, which is, I think, like a 6x6 board, and you press down and the board sort of remembers where you placed all the pieces. So when you place the winning piece, it lights up no matter how you've got your 4 in a row. Again, I'm not telling anybody they should seek it out unless you're a big Connect 4 head, but I liked it way more than I expected. I can see people who have family and friends who love Connect 4, who aren't interested in hobby games at all. For those kind of people, if you got a big Connect 4 fan in your life, I would recommend Smart 4 Connected. And when you leave a review on it, tell Mark sent you.
I guess it looks like you could also play this against the board itself.
Yes.
This review I'm seeing.
Yeah. So I actually wrote that up, the description.
Oh, no. I came across another page. It's like...
Okay, well, we should have read the description that I wrote up. Anyhow, so yeah, you can play versus the computer in 3 different skill levels. And there's another game called Lights Out, which is sort of like an Othello sort of thing that you can play against the AI, but I enjoyed it.
Okay, this game costs $80.
Okay, don't buy for $80. We didn't buy for $80. You shouldn't buy for $80. But if you can get it for less, then
If you
I
look
would
at the
say-
product photo, okay, the first one, the children could not be over 7 years old each.
it's Connect
And
4.
then the next one is the child's father.
Yeah, all ages. It's the age I think on the cover is 6 to 99.
And then you didn't even put a photograph on BGG.
Okay, I can't do everything. I can't bring it to you and put all the pictures up and do all this other stuff. Step by step. I wrote the description. I found it. I found it out of nowhere. I did the category. I did the mechanism. Can you at least put the picture up? You're looking at the picture right now. You're telling me you're looking at the picture. You might as well add it.
It's $75 on AliExpress.
Don't
Do you know
get it. It's
normally
$75.
that's like $4? Why are we
think-
talking to people about this, Mark?
All right.
Do you
'Cause
understand
I'm
jumping
breaking
shark?
new ground on this. I set
thought
the player
Kellen was
count. I
shark
set the playing
jumping.
time. I set all this. Age 4 plus, that was me. All the stuff that you're seeing on the page, that's me. All right? Who is it? It's me. All right. So that is Smart 4 Connected by Geiker, which is a publisher that didn't exist on BGG before I added it. I'll have you know. No design credit, but that's it. Smart 4 Connected. Neelan, tell us about a game that's got to live up to Smart 4 Connected now. Skytear Horde.
Yeah, Skytear Horde similarly didn't exist on BGG at all until I discovered it. But here we are. The much anticipated. No, this was a recent Kickstarter that's just delivered. This is a spin-off of Skytear, which most famously is a game that Mark and I have been trying to play for about 4 years now. For whatever reason, whenever we've tried to line up the opportunity to play this, it's just never happened. But Skytear is sort of like a MOBA in a box card game, which is intriguing. But Skytear Horde kind of turns that into the genre that progenited MOBAs, like the tower defense game. So this is a solo or cooperative experience where you have a deck of cards and multiple lanes, and on every round of the game you're going to reveal a new monster or two new monsters from the monster deck. Each of those monsters goes into the lanes. They sometimes have negative effects when they come out, and then you're going to be spending the mana that you accumulate on each turn in order to play cards. So as this all sounds, this is very much in the vein of like a Magic the Gathering style card game. You know, you are facing an ally that you play against a monster that comes out. Each one has an attack. Each one has health. They deal their damage to each other and lose life accordingly. Unlike something like a Magic the Gathering, you know, they have life points that persist from round to round. You are constantly getting waves of monsters coming out, and you're trying to best utilize the positioning of your monsters, the spells you're playing, utilizing mana effectively, which you can bank from turn to turn, in order to defeat the monsters, defeat each of the three waves before they overwhelm you and deal enough damage to your castle. The thing that kind of makes this pretty neat is there's a fair amount of variability in the box. Like, even before you want to start diving into like deck construction, you have 3 different themed monster decks that you can play against. Each of them kind of feel pretty different in how they start to overwhelm you, whether it's one that just like summons lots of small little monsters, one that occasionally just has these big sort of overwhelming mini boss battles that will come out. On top of that, there are 3 base colored ally decks, which are your human player decks that you can experiment with. There are varying difficulties. There are different castles you can use that either give you different starting health or different abilities that you can utilize every turn. And like I mentioned, if you really want to sort of dive into like how granularly customizable this can be, you can start building your own decks from each of those cards and really start mixing up things up in that way. That said, after a little bit of hiccups with some of the rules and things that aren't necessarily explained in an intuitive way, I kind of found that it was very easy to get through games of this with relative ease. So, you know, this takes about half an hour to play if you're playing it solo. It has a very satisfying curve in terms of the difficulty, where it starts to feel at the very beginning like it's just insurmountable, and then as you get your deck rolling, you slowly feel yourself like, you know, creeping against the oncoming onslaught. One of the things that's kind of neat is there's this mechanic where there are minions that at the start of the game, all they're doing, they're not really attacking you, they're just whittling down your deck. So you see your deck thinning and thinning over time, and you sort of have to divide your attention away from the monsters towards the minions in order to stop them from milling your deck. So it's just got enough constant threats that you have to divide your time between. Each game is also punctuated by big boss monsters. So if you attack the enemy portal enough, eventually a big boss card comes through. You attack the portal again, a second boss comes through, and then defeating that is what ends the game for you with a win. So yeah, all of that felt very satisfying. This may seem kind of obvious, but like I think ultimately what I was missing from this is kind of, for a game that's like emulating so closely Magic the Gathering, not feeling like you're playing against a human player where you kind of just feel like you can very optimally position everything in a way where they're not best utilizing their abilities, if that makes sense. Like if a monster is in a position where you would think, okay, this is going to seem devastating, but you're very able to outmaneuver it just by terms of lane positioning, it started to feel a little bit like I was just losing some of what appeals about this genre. But that said, for a game that plays in half an hour and captures enough of what I like about that style of Magic the Gathering game, this was decent. I'm enjoying this so far.
I knew nothing about this, as is clear by my question of you of it earlier in the episode, but wow, this is a much different game than original Skytear. They've abstracted the board, right? There's only a number of lanes. There's no map to play on as there was in the original Skytear.
Yeah, it's definitely a pity that I don't know that much about like the rule set for Skytear to really be able to compare this, but that it absolutely is the case, where Skytear is a game about using your cards to maneuver people around a board, like in actual physical play space. This is very much just you have 6 lanes, and every turn monsters come out into those lanes, and you just play a card one per one into those opposing lanes. There's no board per se. It's just literally about cards versus cards, which, I think ends up making it a much cleaner, more streamlined, quicker game in the context of solo. One thing I will say that this game also does offer cooperative and 2 versus 1 gameplay out of the box, but I've not tried those. By all accounts, it kind of seems more geared towards solo than anything else.
And then you're basically like picking the monster you want to fight and going through. Is there like a sense of progression? There's like a weak monster or like a low difficulty and your different levels of difficulty in that way?
Yeah, that's exactly it. There are basically like 3 difficulties. The only real thing that scales is like these portals, which determine both the mana you're getting from round to round and how many monsters you summon from the deck each round. So that's the way you scale the difficulty. But the flavored decks themselves don't seem to necessarily be like, easy, medium, or harder from each other. They're just different flavors. Although the rulebook does give you like, hey, we recommend you play with this basic monster set or this basic deck before you move on to anything else. But yeah, I'm finding the difficulty, at least once you get out of that sort of like intro scenario, I'm finding the difficulty to be quite satisfying in a way that, is the sort of thing I want from a cooperative game. Like I've now played this maybe 5 times and lost 3 of those 5 games, which, that seems like about what I would want from a solo game. But yeah, that is Skytear Horde. Fairly simple game, but one that I'm enjoying.
So thanks to my acquisition of it at the Strategicon Mass Trade, I was able to wrangle a copy of Endless Winter Paleoamericans that I played this week. This is by Fantasia Games and designed by Stan Kordonski, who is the designer of, among other games, Rurik, which is a really, really interesting game that I played a year or so ago that has always struck me as an interesting design. So that, along with the fact that the game seems to be quite hot, I was eager to give it a spin. Before going on, I will say that some of that excitement about the design pedigree and the heat was tamped down a bit by some of the mixed reviews that I've heard about it. So I came in a little trepidatious, but basically with no knowledge about the game or how it worked or what it looked like or anything like that. In Endless Winter, Paleoamericans, you are adding members to your tribe through a deck building mechanism. You are gathering resources through a worker placement mechanism. You are spreading throughout the land through an area majority map mechanism. All the while, you're hunting animals through a set collection mechanism. As that introduction might illuminate, this game has a bit of everything and some of that kitchen sink aspect to it. And it shows not only in that description, but also in the actual table presence. You have a main board for the worker placement part. You got a modular board that makes up the map. You got another board for the animal hunting, not to mention your own personal player board. So a lot of everything, a lot of things going on in this game. Thankfully, despite the fact that there is a lot going on both conceptually and physically, and I need to mention that I was playing the base game. I think this was a successful Kickstarter, and there appear to be quite a bit of expansions and modules available, but this is the base game. So despite the fact that there's a lot going on, the rules are pretty straightforward. On your turn, all you're doing is placing one of your 3 workers, and there are only 4 spots on this worker placement board where you're placing them. And while each of the 4 spots do something different, one of them allows you to add people to your tribe via this deck building. One of them allows you to manipulate the map board. One of them allows you to participate in this set collection via hunting, etc. They all function the same way. So all 4 worker placement spots function the same way generally. First, when you place a worker on it, you have the option of taking a certain action as many times as you can pay for it. So every one of the 4 spots has the first action you can do there. You can do it as many times as you can pay for it. You pay for the actions or the resources or whatever you get with resources. But there's also a currency known as labor. So what labor is a resource that's available on all the cards. So each of the cards represent different tribes people that you're adding to your group, and they all can do different things. But no matter what they do, they all will have a labor value associated with them. And so when you're taking these actions and you're paying for them, you have a choice, which becomes, am I going to use the card for the power that it's on or whatever the benefit of the card is, or am I going to burn it for the labor in order to make this action stronger or whatever? So that's the choice you have when it comes to the cards. After you take this as many times as you want action, then you slide your worker down on the space and you get a related action that you can only take once. So they all, again, share the same theme of place a worker, do this thing as many times as you want or as much times as you want to pay for. Then you slide your worker down and you do another action once, which is like an action associated with the previous action. And then finally, if you're the first person to place their worker on that spot, you get another either bonus action or benefit. So there's no blocking per se, but only the first player to go to any spot gets a bonus that nobody else will be able to access. So you're placing one of your 3 workers. That's 3 worker placements per round. And there are only 4 rounds in the entire game. So it's a total of 12 actions you're doing through the course of the entire game. There are ways to get bonus resources and quote-unquote bonus actions, but really it is truly around 12 actions the entire game. And yet, while the game is straightforward, and I wouldn't call it heavy, there is perhaps unsurprisingly a lot going on. Our 3-player game went about 2.5 hours, which I suspect you could trim down for sure, but probably I would think not too far under 2 hours would be my guess. Because while the turns are straightforward, there are still at least 2 steps, if not a 3-step process for every time you put your worker down. And that's not counting all the other considerations you have to make as far as how you're going to pay for the actions and what exactly you want to do. As far as the game itself, I liked it. It's a game that will certainly give you the sense that either that you've accomplished a lot, or at least you've accomplished a lot in whatever path you decide to go down. So for example, I went down a hunting focused path, and by the end of the game I had something like 30 cards representing the different animals that I'd captured near my tableau. It's a game where you start slight and then suddenly things multiply and multiply. That said, while I felt quite successful in my hunting strategy, although I ended up finishing second overall, by the endish of the game I felt like I'd hit my head on the roof of that path. And so I had a little bit of, well, I've seen everything that there is to see going down this road. And I think the other players at the table sort of had a similar feeling about the style that they played. That's not to say that I wouldn't be excited to play it again and try one of the other different play styles, but it's a game that leaves you, at least in my experience, feeling a little too accomplished, if that makes any sense. There's not too much of like if I only had one more turn kind of feeling. By the end, with our last couple of workers, we were like, where can we squeeze out a couple more points? But you didn't really feel like you were going down your path, getting stronger and stronger. You felt like you'd sort of tapped it out. So while I would definitely recommend Endless Winter if you're good with that type of game, a game that looks like a lot, that offers a lot, that has a lot of different options and mechanisms and isn't too complicated, which is great, the fact that it isn't too complicated given that how much there is in there. But I suspect I might start to feel like I've had my fill once I've gone through the main scoring strategies. There is a lot of room for variety in the way the cards come out and the way that you have this modular map that can be constructed differently every game, and not to mention all the expansions, which again I have not played. But still, I feel like, at least in the base game, whichever path you decide to go down, you'll probably get the sense by the end of the game that you've seen all there is that path has to offer once you've finished. But you're going to have a really fun time getting there, I think. So that is Endless Winter Paleoamericans by Fantasia Games and designed by Stan Kordonsky.
I really like the look of this one, and it happens to get caught up in like the clamor around worker placement deck building games at the time, when Dune Imperium and Runes of Arnak were both sort of in vogue. My gut says that I would probably dig this, but it's definitely disheartening to hear that you kind of felt like you'd explored most of the limits of it, even on the first game.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are going to be you can go the hunting path, you can go like the adding a tribe, and you definitely are going to taste a little bit of each of the different flavors when you play, but I think the idea is you probably want to focus on one. And yeah, by the end, all the players who had focused on their own thing sort of were saying like, oh, where am I going to place this? There's nothing I really need to do. How can I get a couple more points? So everybody sort of had that same feeling. But it is fun. You do have that like look at things sort of growing feeling, but it is very, again, feeling like you hit your head on the maximum of whatever strategy you go on.
So were you still enjoying it towards like the very tail end of it? Did you feel like it overstayed its welcome, or you were still like, once you got to the point that you kind of felt like, okay, now my engine is like in full swing, everything's going, was it still like fun, or did you kind of just wish that it had already ended at that point?
I feel like I would have probably had a better time if it was maybe not one round shorter, because then again, you're talking about just having 9 actions. But, if that last round had been 1 action instead of 3, I mean, again, it felt like when we hit the 10th turn, somewhere in that vicinity, we had gotten close to maxing out. So maybe a full round off actually would have been a lot better. It would have felt more like Marco Polo, like, oh man, I really want to play. I feel like I could maximize even more. Yeah. But yeah, by the end, like, again, I did the hunter strategy and I collected every set that was available, and I just a little bit like, oh, what do I do now? Sort of thing. Before we go on to Mr. Bruna Cathala, a couple of words here in the middle. This is the last call for anybody who is interested in submitting their top 20 games of all time for our listener Top 20 episode, which will be coming out soon. Again, you can do that at boardgamebarrage.com/top20 and submit your top 20 games. We will collate them. Nealon will do his data engineering magic, and we will be doing that on a future episode. So we'll be excited about that. And just another reminder, although we've been talking about it a lot, that we will be at Dice Tower West, which is March 8th through the 12th. I will be around much longer than that since I live in Vegas. But if you're going to be around for Dice Tower West, please let us know. We'd love to try to hang out if possible. We have sent emails to patrons about a get-together, so check that out if you haven't already. And yeah, looking forward to that. So now let's do our BGB DOG on Bruna Cathala. How's that sound? That sounded good. I've got to say that when it came to trying to figure out who to do on this designer deep dive, I picked Cathala because of how prolific and influential he is. And while I like many of his games, I don't think I have any of his games in his top 50. So I was a little concerned that I might not be super excited in researching him. But I got to say that in learning about him, it's been one of the most fun deep dives on a designer that I've ever done. So, a little backstory. Bruna Cathala was born in a small town near Lyon, France. And I almost said France there. And this is just like a heads up in general for the rest of this deep dive. There's a lot of French words. I'm not going to even try to bigneify it. So this is going to be an anglicization of all the words. So my apologies in advance to Mr. Cathala and the French people in general.
I love bignify as a verb. It's like...
Yeah. And obviously when I say bignify, I mean use the terms in the proper French pronunciation. Anyhow, so he was born in a small town near Lyon, France, which I know Lyon because it's a popular football team. But anyhow, born in a small town, grew up liking games, but playing mainly sort of like the Monopolies and Risk and stuff like that, the mass market stuff. He had parents who were teachers, but they were busy, not really interested in playing games, and a younger sister who he had a hard time wrangling into playing games. So didn't really have a gaming group, and so liked games but didn't have many options to play them. He said that a turning point in his life early on was when a friend of his gave him a magazine, and I don't remember the French title, but it translates to Games and Strategy, which is about hobby board games, and opened his eyes up to a world of games that he never knew existed. That got him to buy, which I think was his first hobby game ever, which is a game called Fief, which I guess is still in print. I think there's a Fief 2 by Philippe Moshboff. And that was a game that, again, was his entree into hobby games in general, but also it appealed to him because the designer got the game published because he'd won a design competition. So that, he said, was a turning point because he had never thought of games as being designed. He just sort of like imagined them always being there. And the fact that this person had won a design competition and had his game designed just made him realize that this was even a possibility. So he was saying like that this all happened around the age of 20, give or take, and he set it in his mind that he was going to design a game. Like that was his goal. But he had work and stuff like that, so that actually ended up coming much, much later. He's actually took him a long time to get into the design world, even though he seems ubiquitous in terms of like the board game world. And this is sort of like a jumping ahead, but he's been playing games his entire life. He had this idea around 20 that I want to design a game, but he didn't actually get a game published until he was around 40. So it was a long time between this desire and the actual game being published or even being designed. And this was like not the time frame he was envisioning. He was envisioning making games much earlier, but it's just how things worked out. As far as that 20-year period between getting into games and designing a game, he played a ton of games. He said he bought and played and taught his friends tons and tons of games. But his day job was as an R&D engineer in material sciences. And that is going to pop up later when we talk about how he designs games. This is fascinating, the way he designs games. But I guess this is as good a time as any, because in 2002, he designed his first couple of games, and he didn't start out with one game. He actually started out his first year designing games. He had 4 games published. There's a little bit of an interesting story with that, but let's talk about how he designs games. So as an R&D guy, he worked with tungsten polymers, I think it was, something like that, like a very niche sort of aspect of material sciences. And again, he worked in R&D, so he's working in like theoretical stuff. They're trying to come up with ideas. And it's a very expensive field, I guess. And so when he's trying to cook up ideas, cooking up products in his day job, he would propose stuff to his manager, and, you know, he'd say, like, let's try doing this. And his manager would tell him, like, all right, but that's going to be really expensive to try if it doesn't work. Why should we sink a whole bunch of resources into this now? You know the laws of physics, you know the laws of science, all this stuff before, you can just figure it out and then let us know if it's going to work, and then we'll put funding into it. All this early stuff, like, let's try to avoid paying for it because it's just really, really expensive. So it got him in this mind frame where he would think about, in terms of his work, all the stuff getting to the like finished product, and, you know, work on it and like think about it, and a lot of in his head sort of planning. And then he would finally propose it to his superiors once he had everything figured out. And so that's how he actually designs games. He will, and we'll go into this in more detail later on, but when he comes up with an idea for a game, he is not the type to like prototype something right away and then, you know, playtest. He says that when he has an idea, he will play the game in his head. He will like figure out the game and play it in his head. He says he plays like 2 players or 3 players in his head, and he will keep doing that. And when he sees an issue, he'll think about it, and he'll think about ways around it, or think about ways to fix it. And then he'll do that until he has like a pretty firm understanding of what the game should be. And then he makes a prototype. So apparently when he does his first prototype, they tend to be fairly close to what the finished product is going to be.
Interesting. Like, he's already done a bunch of just like internal playtesting before he even has a prototype.
Yeah. I mean, he definitely does agree about how important playtesting is.
Sure.
It's a huge part of his like design, but he says that often his first prototypes are very playable, like very close to what they eventually end up being. So let's talk about the first couple games. So first couple games were initially, there were a game called Lawless, and I think the other one was Tony and Tino. Lawless was a multiplayer game, and Tony and Tino was a 2-player game, which is a type of game he actually really likes designing. He really enjoys 2-player games. So he goes to the publisher, which is a publisher is now defunct. I think it was purchased by Asmodee, surprise, surprise, which was called Descartes Editor, I guess. It's a French company. And so he goes to them and he says, okay, here's this game and here's this game, and what do you think about them? And they really like it. And this is, again, he made his first game. This was around the age of 40. And it was like he designed it in this style where it's in his head and he makes a prototype. And so from that first prototype to him signing a contract, I think it was like 2 months. It was a really quick turnaround. And so he shows the publishers. They really like it, but they say, like, you know, if this 2-player game, it'd be really nice if we could do it as a series of 3 games. And then so Cathala says, well, are you saying you want me to do 3? And he's like, well, if you can do 2 more games that are good, we'll buy them from you. And sure enough, he goes home, and a couple months later, again, I think the whole thing was like a 6-month thing. He has contract signs on the other 2 games, and so his first year of publishing, he releases 4 games, which are Lawless, Tony and Tino, and then Drake and War and Sheep. I've heard of none of these games, but it is impressive that his first foray into designing games, he has 4 published all in one go.
It's also like very pleasing to know that he started with 2-player games, which is not something I knew previously, because I feel like where he has re-entered my awareness recently is largely in the work he's been doing on 2-player games. So that's cool to know that's where he began.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't even mention his pedigree, so I'll just go over a number of these games, and then I'm just going to double back to some of the highlights, some of the most interesting stories about his design. So his first big design was Shadows over Camelot, and this was a game with the just passed away Serge Leggett. This was one of the first hidden trader games, for those who don't know, and was a trailblazer in that field of hidden traders. Later, there's Mr. Jack. He's got Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, Jamaica, Cyclades was another big design, Five Tribes, Abyss, Seven Wonders Duel. Up until the current day, he's got a couple of games, Moon River, due next year, another one called Lumen the Lost World, or Calcum, which is a game that Nealon recently reviewed, Sea Salt and Pepper, which is a game that Nealon, I think, also reviewed recently, and that is available on BGA for those who are interested, and was also nominated for a Spiel for a kids version of Kingdomino.
And Splendor Duel, bro.
Yeah, Splendor Duel. So again, this guy's super prolific. Anyhow, so let's talk about some games specifically that I wanted to highlight. Again, I mentioned Shadows over Camelot, which is a co-design with him and Sir Leggett. This is a theme that you'll see in a lot of his games where he's co-designs quite a bit. He says he likes to co-design because he likes to design things with his friends. He likes the camaraderie of it is primarily why he likes to co-design, which brings me up to the first game that I want to talk about, which is Mr. Jack. So Mr. Jack was a game that was co-designed with Ludovic Montblanc. This game, and again, he's got a ton of these really interesting stories of where these games originated from. So he says when he designs games, there are three sources of sort of inspiration. And when it comes to inspiration for games, he is not a person who will try to figure out theme or something or try to come up with an inspiration. He just waits until it comes to him. He'll do other stuff, and then when an inspiration comes to him, that's when he starts working on a game. And so it's a very organic thing. But for him, inspiration comes in one of three sources. It's either a mechanism that he wants to play around with, a theme that he's interested in, or a component. So more about that later. But the story of Mr. Jack was he was at a convention. I think this was a Essen Spiel, and there's a lot of stories of him going to these conventions and staying at a designer's house to cut costs and stuff like that. So he was staying at a friend's place for Essen, I believe, and he is with Ludovic Montblanc, who is also staying there at this designer's house, and they can't sleep. And so because they can't sleep, Ludovic comes to him and says, "Hey, do you want to try designing a game?" And Cathala says, "Sure, what do you have in mind?" And Ludovic says, "I want a game that has to do with light and dark." And Cathala says, "Okay, all right, what else?" And he's like, "That's all I got so far." And so they were trying to figure out a game that incorporated light and dark. They went with a vampire thing earlier on, and then they figured, okay, they're not really interested in vampires. Then they thought criminal, and then that's where they started researching Jack the Ripper and went with that. So again, this will be a thing that happens quite a bit with him. A theme of his designs where they seem to just spring out of nowhere. The next game I want to talk about is 2014's Five Tribes. So Five Tribes is the quintessential, as far as I'm concerned, Bruna Cathala game. This is a game where, again, he's always juggling designs as most designers do. He has a bunch of ideas. But Five Tribes, he says, was a game that just came fully formed in his head. Just the entire idea of it just came to him, and was a game where, he already has a very quick turnaround from in his head to a prototype to being published. This was a game where he had the idea in his head, again, played around with it in his brain, play testing it in his mind, and had a prototype within that weekend. And then the game was pretty much fully done 2 months after that. Just an incredible pace of it, and just in some ways inspirational, and in all ways interesting that he just has this ability to have these games conceptualized in pretty full forms. And that was the case with Five Tribes. The next game I want to talk about is Seven Wonders Duel. I want to bring it up just because it's another funny story where he was flying to Gen Con, happened to be on the same plane as Antoine Bauza. They're sitting, I guess, next to each other. And to pass the time, Bauza tells him, and Bauza's a friend of his, that, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing a 2-player version of Seven Wonders, but I just can't crack it. Do you want to talk about it?" And during the plane flight, they just cracked Seven Wonders Duel. And, shortly thereafter, they had the game out. And hearing him talk about the challenges of converting a game like Seven Wonders to Seven Wonders Duel is fascinating. That's the idea that, you have to keep the symbology there. You have to keep the different colors there. But he was never a fan of the science scoring in Seven Wonders, so he wanted to sort of change that, and you can see that's a quite a big change in Seven Wonders Duel. The idea that military in Seven Wonders in the original game, you're fighting against your neighbor to your left and your neighbor to your right, but of course in a 2-player game you don't have that, so it became a push-pull thing, which is an interesting natural progression from that in a 2-player game. So again, just fascinating the way that he is in this situation. He's on a plane, his friend, who's a designer, says, "Hey, can you help me do this?" And they just do it on this plane flight. Just really, really interesting. And then the last game I want to talk about is Kingdomino, which is a game that, again, I said his inspiration comes from three sources, either mechanism, theme, or component. Kingdomino is a game where he wanted to make a game that had dominoes. He had the idea, like, let's do a domino game, and that was the inspiration for Kingdomino. And so just a fascinating guy to hear about, a guy who breaks the mold in so many ways. Like, did not get into game design young, was a game player for over 20 years, but was in the hobby for 20 years before he designed anything. Started designing in his 40s. A guy who, loves to co-design, who has won a couple spiels at this point. And hearing him talk about how it felt to win the spiel, it just really warmed my heart, because it sounds like, again, despite how prolific and how successful he is, you can tell he's like a game player who just has had the success. Like, you can see yourself as a person who's played the game, who loves the hobby, and you can hear him talk about winning the spiel in that way. And you can sort of transpose yourself there, and it's just really fun to hear him talk about that kind of thing.
Mark, do you have anything that's like a cohesive feel about Cathala's games that occur to you? Because kind of like I said earlier, like the main source of like attachment I have to him is kind of just the idea that he is very good at refining games into like 2-player versions, right? Like that's kind of the thing that he's become very well known for recently, I would say. A lot of his bigger games, I wasn't even especially aware at the time that they were Cathala games, like Five Tribes, for example, or even actually Shadows over Camelot. That's a game that has kind of been sitting in the back of my brain as a game I feel like I should have played at some point. It's probably fairly outdated at this point, but I don't think I even realized that was a Cathala game. So what would you say, like, if you have any connective tissue on what makes a Cathala game to you?
That is a great question, because I think there is a definite connective tissue, and he talks about this, and that is, he says that he designs games that he wants to play. His primary goal is to make a game that he would want to play. He says he often knows that a game is going to be good when he plays it or play tests it, and immediately whoever he's playing with wants to play it again. So he's always looking for a game that is fun to him. And the games that are fun to him are midweight games. A big thing for him is, like, it should not be complicated to teach. So he wants games that have a light rule set, but that are not necessarily like light in and of themselves. He also likes games that have a dash of luck in them. He thinks the ideal game is a game where if you win, you feel like you were clever, but if you lose, you feel like you're unlucky. And a game where everybody legitimately has a chance, but like the stronger player should win the most, but it shouldn't be a game like chess where going in you're going to get stomped if you're not the better player. And I've heard that idea before where, clever versus like unlucky, but it does ring true. And if you look at his games, a lot of them are like this midweight sort of family level game. The other thing I think is sort of interesting about him is, despite the fact that he's made a lot of interesting, multiplayer games, and while he enjoys 2-player games the most, it was interesting to hear him talk about solo games. He's not really into solo games. For him, the social aspect of gaming is quite important. He says he's a real shy person, and so he really looks forward to gaming as a way to interact with people. And yeah, so I'd say like if there's one common theme for his games, it's like he likes small rule sets, midweight, with a lean toward 2-player, but not obviously exclusively that. But that's the Cathala game, I think.
It's like so eclectic and hard to pin down. I think that, back in the day, it's funny to like pretend that you're an OG because you've been playing board games for not that long. Like I feel like you could not get away from Mr. Jack and like Jamaica specifically, were the two that like I just like remember everybody playing, and they're not Euro games. You know what I mean? Like that's a interesting throughput. And it's also like interesting to me that we haven't even hit like Cyclades or Mission Red Planet, which are both like notable just on the face of it.
Yeah.
In terms of like doing interesting things with area control, and Mission Red Planet sort of being like a hidden gem that has slowly and continually risen up. It's so hard to pin down. I do think that like his 2-player games have a lot of tempo considerations and like taking extra actions or turns and using sort of like this back and forth, but I can't like substantiate it too well. I would say that since the beginning of the podcast, the one game that I've kept on my shelf from him that I really want to play, and I'm now like inspired to, like, I need to really keep What's Coming to Dice Tower West small.
Yeah.
Like, I think I'm going to keep it to 3 games. Okay. Study in Emerald First Edition. Thank you, Mark.
Absolutely. For sure.
What was the second one? Pax Porfiriana.
I would love to. God, I would love to.
The third one, Mr. Bruno Cathala's Senji, which is a 90-minute to 2.5-hour area control / negotiation game. And, my experience with this was just based on So Very Wrong About Games covering it, which is like that you can do negotiations with people where like you offer up other people's family members as like prisoners. Like
Right.
Neelan, I could offer you Neelan's grandma, right, in exchange for like some peace treaty or whatever. Love that. So those are the 3.
Okay.
But there can't be any more because there's no way I'll get to them. So
Right.
those are the 3.
We still have to work on that list. We have to still work on
No.
that list.
Well, that's my list. That's all
your
I'm
contribution,
committing
yeah.
to.
No, I that's good. I appreciate that. So that is going to do it for our BGB DOG Designer of Games series on Mr. Bruna Cathala.
Zany Penguins.
Is that a Cathala game?
Yes.
Oh my god, I didn't even know. I love that
You
game.
didn't even bring that up. It's one of your favoriteest games.
Yeah.
Baby Arboretum with penguins.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you are 100% right. That is a huge oversight on my part. I love that game. That's probably my favorite Cathala game. See, like Neelan said, he didn't realize that Shadows over Camelot was a Cathala game. I didn't even realize Zany Penguins was a Cathala game. And as you said, Callum, it is sort of hard to find like a throughput. You can't really nail down, especially now, like when I think of Cathala games, I think of like accessible midway games, but there isn't like a, Eric Lang, you have like, it's going to be fighty. There's like that part to it generally. And Knizia is going to be like very mathematically sound. It feels like there's less of a commonality. So when you told me Zany Penguins is a Cathala game, it's something that does, surprise me, even though it doesn't in retrospect, but like I had no idea. That I love that game. But yeah, why don't you tell us your favorite? I didn't even know my favorite Cathala game was Zany Penguins. And so I would go to the Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord if I was a listener and say, hey, Zany Penguins is my favorite. We would love for you to do the same. Go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Tell us what your favorite Cathala game is. Maybe give us a recommendation on a Cathala game. The guys produce so many games that I would love to hear your favorites. So we are amassing the list of games to play at Dice Tower West. Maybe a game that you recommend could jump on that list. We would love to hear about it. We would love to hear from you in a number of different ways, including emailing us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can go to our guild at boardgamebarrage.com/guild if you want to chat with us on our guild. You can find us on all forms of social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. Just search Board Game Barrage. Big thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next week, in which we will all be together in Vegas, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Are you familiar with the app Splitwise?
Is this like you go to a restaurant and you like split the tab?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Christina and I use this.
Okay.
And she is murdering me right now. Okay, so about 2/3 of the way through the episode, I start getting pings on my phone. Okay. You owe Christina $1,000, $1,600. We're like at $3,700.
Wow. All right.
And I started about 2/3 of the way in. I had to start adding back from my credit card statement to fight back against it. I've been fighting back against it. I'm in my Amazon going, did she want something with Red Bull? I'm not lying. That's fair. I did ask you to do it, but wow.
We'll cut that part out.
It is warfare.
That's funny.
We all get to use the same toilet.
That's right. Preferably at the same time. No,
yeah.
Probably should be cut out.